Hello, I'm science illustrator and artist Mattias Lanas. Today, we'll be looking at one of artist-explorer Tony Foster's paintings of icebergs from the Arctic and using that to inspire a watercolor demonstration painting of a seascape with special focus on painting water. Tony Foster painted the Arctic because of a nomination by British author Kari Herbert, who spent the first years of her life living in an Inuit village in Greenland and who feels a strong attachment to that place. In 2001, Foster traveled to the coast of southwestern Greenland to a place called Ilulissat and put up with a harsh environment to create large format landscape paintings of the Kangia ice fjord, complete with towering icebergs. One of these artworks is included in the Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey, highlighting some of the world's most beautiful places. One of my favorite things about this painting, called Ilulissat from 400 feet above our camp at Kingintok, looking 220 degrees true southwest across the Kangia, is that Foster decided to include a boat to provide a sense of scale for the truly massive icebergs in the seascape. There are so many interesting elements to observe in this artwork, notably the icebergs, but also the lichen-covered rocks in the foreground and the dynamic skies. But for today's demonstration, I've chosen to focus on the sea and more broadly on water. Water is a pretty challenging subject for artists to paint. Not only is it a translucent liquid, it comes in infinitely variable forms and can have different qualities depending on its environment. Therefore, there isn't one trick to painting water except that of treating it like any other subject and genuinely observing and painting its shapes and colors without overthinking. Water can reflect its surroundings, especially the sky and clouds, and especially when there's no wind. It can exhibit texture such as ripples, eddies, and waves. It refracts light and can cast shadows. It can appear completely invisible if it's free of sediment, revealing submerged objects. But it can also lose its translucency when churned up, such as in river rapids or beach surf, or if it's loaded with sediment such as in a stream after heavy rainfall. The way that Tony Foster has rendered the ocean in this painting demonstrates he's capitalized on several qualities of water to accurately represent the subject. We see ripples on the water's surface, light and dark undulating shapes that recede and diminish as they move into the background, reflections of some of the land masses and icebergs, broken up by the ripples on the ocean surface, highlights and shadows, and a striking diversity of colors mirroring those of the environment. One could spend years learning to paint water in all of its diverse shapes and colors. So, for the purposes of this short demonstration, I've chosen a simple photograph of mine from which we'll paint, with bonus pelicans as its focus. A major advantage of this is that we'll omit one big challenge of painting water: its movement. The photo lets us focus on a snapshot in time. After following along with this demonstration, I recommend you work up to painting water live in the field as a more advanced exercise. If you'll be following along with this demonstration, be sure to check out my materials video beforehand. We'll be using a full array of watercolor materials today, including watercolor paper, a pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, paper towel, and masking fluid. Gather up your materials and have a copy of the photo reference handy, and let's get to work.
To start out, I've gone ahead and created the drawing based on this photo. I've got the two pelicans, and these are done pretty dark because these are dark subjects, and so it doesn't matter if I draw them out a little more firmly, a little bit more boldly than some of the other features in this landscape. And especially because I'm going to be doing some layers of washes, and I don't want that pencil to fade too much. I want to be able to see at the very end, still see that pencil mark so that I can paint in these pelicans. But you can see the rest of the landscape is very, very subtle. And that's because I don't want any hard pencil lines to show through. I want it all to be very light. And this is going to be a simplified water landscape. So we're going to work on creating some of the forms that give us a sense of a vast expanse of water spreading out into the distance until the shoreline. And we have fog going on as well at the very top. And this transition between the fog, the shore, and the water is going to be very gradual and very subtle. Also, you may have noticed that I put tape around my piece. So I created this masked border with tape so that when I paint in and create my wash, I get a clean edge at the very end. And I didn't mention this earlier, and you're welcome to not use tape at all. But if you do have some artist's tape and want to create a clean border around your piece, you're more than welcome to use it. So now to get started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mask out parts of these pelicans so that we can create washes without fear of them getting too dark and covered up with color. So I've got my masking fluid. I'm going to take a dowel. I like to use a wooden dowel like this, and just mask off the areas that are lighter in the pelicans. So for me, that's this part of the wing up here where the sunlight is hitting it. The rest, because it's so dark, you don't really need to mask, because we're not going to get that dark with the background. You can always get darker on top of it. But it's nice to have some light areas like this. It provides good contrast. So mask away. You can also mask the entire thing if that's easier for you. I'm working in a much smaller format than I normally do. And that's because, one, I want to keep this video to a reasonable length. And two, I'd like to emphasize the simplicity of this exercise. This is to teach you a very basic understanding of how to paint water. And we'll work small and quickly just to get through that and not spend so much time refining large shapes. You can do a larger painting after this. So now that our piece is masked, we're going to wait for this to dry completely before we begin anything with watercolor. It's been a good few minutes, and now I'm certain that this masking fluid is completely dry. You want to make sure that's the case, otherwise you'll have issues with it mixing with the watercolor. So I've pre-wet some of my paints on my palette, and now I'm going to mix up my base color for a foundational wash. We're going to do the sky and the sort of background first, and then we're going to work on the foreground and all the water second. So let's start over here. I'm going to take some Cerulean Blue, and I'm going to mix this with some Indian Red, just a little bit to mute it down. We shouldn't get a purple because they're kind of opposite colors in terms of their temperature. So the Indian Red is a much more warm, earthy red, and this blue is pretty cool. So we get kind of a gray. And let's do a test of this.
To me, this could use some more Indian red, so I'll mix a tiny bit more of that in. I want it pretty dulled down, pretty gray, neutral in the background. Let's see this now. It's pretty good. Okay, so I'll take a second brush now, and I'm going to pre-moisten the paper where I'm going to be painting. So up here, I'll just go ahead and do the entire thing. I'm using a flat brush for this one, something that can load a bunch of water, and go right up to the horizon line. By the way, I've drawn that with a ruler. Horizon lines in particular you want to get right. You don't want the angle of them to be slightly off, because that will just make your piece look funny if you have a horizon line that's just kind of skewed and not perfectly straight. Make sure you get water over the entire surface. And now we'll take our color that we've mixed up. I'm going to add a bit of water to that because I don't want it to be intense at all. I want it to be close to white. So I'm adding some water to this to really dilute it. Test that out. That looks pretty good. Take this color and just lay the entire thing over from left to right, right to left, however you want. Very subtle. That's how we want it. We'll leave that be for now. In the meantime, we're going to mix up the color for the water. So for that, I'm going to use a different pool over here, and I'll take a brush and create a pool over there. I'm going to use Cerulean Blue again. For this one, I want to mix up a lot because I'm going to be using this throughout the piece and on a large part of the piece as well. And then I'm going to mix some of that French Ultramarine with this to deepen the blue a bit. Good start. So let's get some of that color off so I can actually use it. And I'll switch brushes again. I'm going to clean this flat brush off, and just like before, we're going to pre-moisten this paper. You want to time it so that this over here dries up by the time that you've gotten to it with the water. Otherwise you're going to get bleeds between these two, backwashes between. But I think I can do that. So okay, so this paper has been pre-moistened now. I'm going to grab some of my mixture, and I'm using the same brush now. Maybe dilute a little bit, so take some water, mix that in. And we're basically going to drop this in certain areas. If you squint and look at the reference photo, see if you can break apart some of the major shapes, major darks and lights. I definitely have something going on right here. Looks like there's some nice blue at the bottom. And you're not trying to create all of these horizontal lines right now because these are going to fade out and spread, but you just want to get a bit of an overall sense of where some of the patches of darks and lights are. And they're kind of everywhere here, so feel free to go liberally, just start adding some of these in. We're just setting a foundation. What I recommend you don't do though is completely paint the entire thing blue, because we have some whites in here. If you do that, you're going to either have to lift later, if that's possible, or use some other method to try to get your lights back. We don't want to get rid of our lights, all of our lights just yet. So just start putting in some of these blues, and the longer you work, the more pigment should come off of your brush, and so the more diluted your brush should be. And as you go into the background, you can just start using that to your advantage. But again, we're just setting a foundation, so that there shouldn't be a lot of pressure for this part. We're just creating a nice background to start with. Keep your lines as horizontal as you can though. That'll really help convey this effect of a vast expanse of water. My paper's drying up a bit towards the top. I didn't have as much water on it when I put this in, and that's okay. I'm going to work with it. While this is still wet, do a few more, so keep squinting at the piece. And let yourself be very loose with this. See if you can enjoy this process. Another thought, as you go further into the background, try to make your lines a lot crisper and thinner, especially if your paper's already dried back here like mine is. I can take advantage of that. I'm going to switch brushes to one that can hold a bit more water, and kind of on a whim I've decided that I want to add some Cerulean Blue to this as a foundational wash. So we're going to make a pool over here, take some cerulean, and do this quickly before this dries, but we'll mix up our cerulean. Let's see if that's good enough. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so I'll take this and just start to lay some bigger swatches essentially of cerulean over this. Take some water, dilute this further, and let's do the entire background now. We'll leave the whites primarily at the front, and this is still going to be very light because this will dry lighter than we're placing it, and so it's a light wash overall. Something like that. Okay, while we're here, this part up here for me has mostly dried. There's still a tiny bit of dampness. That's perfect actually. Let me rinse off my flat brush. We're gonna start pulling in that mountain shape. Got kind of a looming gray mass in here, very subtle. And then we have some darker elements in the shore, right against the horizon line. So for that, I'm gonna take some burnt sienna and some French ultramarine, mix those together and create kind of a dark gray or black. That's great, but it's very dark. It's way too dark for what I need, so I'm going to add lots of water to that to dilute it. Let's try that. Ooh, much better. I'll start with the mountain. You know what, I think that's still too dark, so let's add a little bit of water to our brush and use that to dilute this on the page. I'll wet my brush, kind of clean it off a bit and give it another pass, and this time I'm kind of lifting a bit as I go. That's good, and then I'll take some more of this darkness that I've mixed up and start to add it to the shoreline. I don't want that edge to be super crisp, so I might come back and fuzz it out a little bit with the brush. I'm leaving a bit of a lighter line haphazardly at the bottom, and I'm going to avoid this part for now, wait till this dries. But I could take a clean brush and wet it a little bit and then use the very tip to kind of clean out or fuzz up the top so that this horizon line element here, these trees, aren't so sharp against the sky. Back to our water, we have a great effect going on now. This is looking like a great foundation. We're going to successively build layers of these little shadow shapes. They're very horizontal shapes that form the ripples in the water. And just to help you visualize this, if you imagine each of these ripples going back into space as little mountains, one side is being hit by light, one side is kind of in shadow. It looks like there's a lot of the sides that are facing us right now that are in shadow, and so that's why we're seeing these darker blue lines. It's the side of the little ripple mountains that are cast in shadow. So we're going to try to convey that. One challenge is going to be not to become too uniform in the way you create these. You want to pay attention to what's going on in the reference photo just to capture some of that likeness of the water. If you become too uniform, you'll still get a water effect, but it will look a little artificial. It'll look like a little too regular. You want some randomness, some chaos in nature. We'll do a combination of those to get this effect just right. So this is pretty dry now. There's still some dampness to it. I'm going to use that. I'll take my flat brush again. This is going to be a very useful brush for this exercise because I can use the very thin side of it as well as the thick side. And I'm going to take some of this initial mixture that I created for the water and we'll add another layer of these lines. So this time it should be a bit more crisp. The one thing is you want to make sure these, as much as possible, stay horizontal. And the general rule is the closer to us these little ripples are, the thicker they're going to be, meaning the taller they're going to be and the more prominent. And then the further they recede into space, the smaller they become and the squatter, thinner they become, until at the very end you're not even seeing ripples. It's just basically a blue expanse that's slowly coming into focus as it comes closer, and then these ripples become more prominent and bigger. So that's the general rule you're going to be working with, but always horizontal. And then some of you have already probably noticed, but under the pelicans we have a darkness, and that's the reflection of those pelicans in the water. So we'll paint those in once the paper has dried more because we want them to be fairly crisp. My paper has buckled. I have one buckle here and another one there. That doesn't help when I'm trying to create nice horizontal lines. I'm going to work with it. Some papers are more tolerant of washes and lots of water on them than others. This one is a thinner grade paper, and so it's not quite as tolerant, but it should be okay. I can press this once it's done and get it to mostly flatten out again. Okay, so adding in these marks. I'm casually looking at my reference for this, but also just kind of going with my gut in creating these. And then again, using those general rules. So the further these go back, the more flat and squat they become, and smaller and more diffused. So I'll wait for this to dry, and in the meantime, looks like this back part is dry now, so I can add in another layer back here. I'm going to take a smaller brush now because I want to focus on some small details. I'll take the original dark mixture that I'd mixed up, make sure that it's diluted enough still, and let's test that out. So that's the French Ultramarine and the burnt Sienna, nice and diluted. And I'll start to add in some of this area over here that I couldn't add in before. I'm only loosely going off of the shapes that I'm seeing in the landscape. Something like that. In some ways this is pretty abstract, but it's beautiful because of that simplicity and that abstractedness. Okay. So we've got a looming mountain in the background, a hazed out kind of shoreline, and now we're going to continue with this area here. The rest is done. We want to keep that nice and simple so that it boosts and contrasts with the water, the darkness and richness of the water, and the pelicans up front. So I'm going to wait for all of this to dry now before I come in with my next layer. Now that this is very dry, I'll start layering in darker colors. This time I'm going to take a broader brush with a very sharp tip and start creating these very lentil-like shapes with a very sharp beginning and then a thick middle and then a sharp ending. These will be horizontal lines with variable width to them. So these mimic what we're seeing in the reference photo here for the way that the water ripples. So first I'm going to rehydrate some of my dried pigment from that first pass, and to this I'm going to add French Ultramarine to darken this. I also like to mute my colors down a bit, as I'm sure you've noticed by now. And so for this, I'm going to add some Indian red to this, just a touch of Indian red to really bring this down, because I don't want it to be too dull. I just do still want it to be bright blue, but I want to give it a hint of murkiness to create colors that are more muted and a little bit more natural feeling. Let's see what we've got. It still looks very blue. Let's add a bit more of the Indian red. And that's closer, that's better. You know what, let's do some more cerulean in here, a bit more French ultramarine too. We'll just intensify this color, and some Indian red again, so I have more to work with. So with this color now, I'm going to continue adding my darks, this time being a bit more selective about where I'm putting them, but same idea, general, starting out gently and thin and going thicker, and then they can taper again in other parts. So I'm going to follow some of these here that I've done already in lighter pigment, but you want these to be variable in width to really convey the light hitting one side and dark on the other, the ripple hills that we were talking about earlier. And I'm working on these ones at the bottom first because these are thick and prominent and large, and so they're sort of easier to do, and I can afford to potentially make mistakes here. As I work my way into the back, I want to be a bit more careful, make sure that they start fading out and becoming more subtle. Remember, I'm doing some of these a bit randomly, and in other ones I'm paying special attention to the reference photo and trying to mimic some of those shapes. Half chaos and half sort of uniform pattern. So that looks all right for here in the front. I'm keeping these nice and horizontal. Let's move into the back now. I'll take some water and dilute this here so it's not as intense. That looks good. Let me dry my brush and grab some of that. And then same thing, I'm just going to continue working as we move back. We'll be a bit smaller, there'll be more of them, they'll be more squat. Oh, you know what, this is way too light, but that's fine, I can add some more diversity to the front. It's all about layering. I'll keep adding these marks. But now I'm getting to the point where I want to start making them a bit more thin as I move further back towards the horizon. And under the pelicans I can add a bit more, because that's going to be dark when I put the reflections of the pelicans in. So this brush is too thick and I don't have the control that I need, so I'm going to switch to a thinner brush to continue going further back, grab some of the same mixture, and then let's try that. So this will allow me to have that extra control to create the fine lines that I need back here. And now it's just a game of patience, and I'm occasionally stepping back to look at the piece from far away because I want to make sure that the overall effect that I'm conveying is what I want. Don't just get caught up in doing all these little details without really stepping back to see if you're getting the effect you need. Okay, so I'm doing some prominent dark marks every once in a while, but as I go further back, I want those to be fewer. I want them to be more subtle and obscured. Get a little water, mix it with this and dilute it so that I can do these background lines without fear of being too dark. Horizontal lines across the entire area. You can also do a little bit of dry brushing, especially with these small brushes that can't load as much water. That happens naturally, and it works pretty well actually for creating kind of a glittery effect on the water surface. And so use that watercolor technique to your advantage. You know, just let it do what it wants to do there. Something like that. Now I'm just refining a bit some of these areas, especially after looking back at the whole scene. I'm seeing that there's too much contrast going on. I want a little bit less of that. But the overall gradation that I have going from the foreground to the background seems to be working pretty well. So what I'm going to do now is do another wash on top using a flat brush and using Cerulean just to brighten this a bit more. This will be a wash that's not super wet because I don't want to disturb the colors underneath or buckle the paper too much, but I do want to add some extra intensity to this overall because it feels a little washed out. So let's get Cerulean. The Cerulean is very bright. Good. Okay, we'll start around here and layer this in. And then I'll take another brush before the sharp edge dries and just wet this a bit, keep it moist, and use it to clean up that sharp edge so that it's not sharp. I want it to be very soft. Like so. Okay, I'll continue layering here towards the foreground. And there's some areas that I want to avoid a bit because I want to retain some of that white, some of that contrast. But I do like the overall effect that the bright cerulean blue is adding to the ocean. And actually I decided, you know what, I'm going to go all the way to the shoreline here and just make that blue as well. So this is looking better. There we go. Okay. So now continue adding in other layers of blue. I'm going to use the same brush and grab some of these blues and add some very thin, subtle texture to the background, especially as this dries. We'll leave that there. Maybe a bit more cerulean and layer it in here in the front, interspersed among the French Ultramarine. Let's add some of these darks in here as well. Continue to just build this up little by little. Maybe an even smaller brush to get to these really far back areas and have that control that I need. Just a hint of darkness, a hint of texture to convey that those ripples continue to extend into the background. Oops, that was too much, too dark. Okay, let's let that dry. Now it's time for one more layer of darkness. As I said, we're just going to build this up layer by layer, continue to increase the intensity, but leaving lots of lights in there. So we're going to take the French Ultramarine mixture that we have, this one up here, and rehydrate some of that. I'm going to add some more French Ultramarine to it, extra darkness, but also we're going to continue to mute that. This time I'm going to mute it with some burnt sienna instead of the Indian red, and make sure that that's fairly intense. So let's get a bit more French Ultramarine, some burnt sienna. Good. And let's test that out. Maybe some more, even a bit more French Ultramarine. I want it to be fairly intense. And burnt sienna. It might have gotten a bit too dark with the burnt sienna, but we'll add some French Ultramarine to it. Let's see what we got. It's a beautiful muted blue. I think that'll add some cooler gray tone to this that we are maybe missing. So same thing, gonna re-emphasize some of these darks with this color. Now start to use some of this also to emphasize some of the reflection of the pelican. And so for this I'm really paying attention to that shape and just trying to get as much of it as I can accurately represented here on the paper of the reflection on the ripples of water. Switch to my small brush again and continue to work. Alright, let's take a look at this. This is looking pretty good. But you know what, I can't shake the feeling we need a little more texture in the back, so let me get some more cerulean. I'll add a tad of this color that I'd mixed up for the front. Good to have some color harmony. And let's see, make sure this isn't too intense. It looks okay. We'll add some more, a little bit more texture in the background. Constant refinement, really emphasizing horizontal. Looks good. Now let's take the small brush and we're going to mix some Ivory Black with French Ultramarine. Create this really deep blue, and to that we're going to add some of the burnt sienna as well, so it should be like a browny bluey black, pretty yucky color, but perfect for what we need for these reflections. And we'll also use these for the pelican, so he can make a bunch of it. Alright, yeah, it's pretty dark. It's good. So take this, our brush is fairly dry, it's just got this pigment, and making sure this isn't wet, it looks good. We'll start refining that shape in here. And same back here, this one's thinner and squatter overall. Believe it or not, I think it's time to let this dry and then remove the Frisket, the liquid mask, so that we can come in and finish up the pelicans. I could do one more layer of pulling out some more intensity in the water, but I think I'm going to skip for now. I tend to overdo it sometimes, so once we take off these strips of tape, I'll have clean edges, and I think that should show the texture of the water pretty well. So we'll let this dry. Alright, now I'll grab an eraser and pull out these very sharp white, very high contrast whites from the Frisket. Let's take our small brush again and we'll use the same black mixture that we had, rehydrate that. And this part's kind of fun, especially because these pelicans are somewhat in silhouette. Actually, they're very silhouetted against the bright light in this photo, so I can use lots of dark color and don't have to worry as much about creating detail, except for in some areas of where there's light. But overall, this is going to be very dark, so I've mixed up that black again. I'm going to add a bit more brown to it because it feels right. Blue, brown, and black. You don't want to use straight black again. It will not really harmonize with the other colors in your painting. So let's take this. And now I'm just going to fill in this pelican, being very careful with the shapes. I love painting negative like this, where, you know, I'm filling the shape in kind of from the inside out. I feel like I can usually get shapes better this way. I'm leaving these areas here white, but I am going to add some water to my brush, dilute this black significantly, and paint in these areas for now, just to bring down some of that bright white. So eventually that's what I'm going to want to do anyways. Even like that, the color is pretty close. I'm working very delicately because of the small format of this painting. These are kind of the key subjects in this piece, so if they don't turn out well, then, you know, the piece isn't going to be as successful. And then for this top wing, pretty light actually, so I'll add the dark areas where I see them, bit of the front of the wing here, and then add some water to my brush and do the rest with a more diluted color. Like that. And that color is actually pretty close to what I want it to be ultimately. I'm going to add some raw umber though to my brush, maybe right here. Fairly diluted, but just enough to give it a hint of a beautiful brown, and then some of that here into the wing. Just a touch of warmth. Now do a bit more refining. Love this leading edge of this wing here. And then this part right here is a little complicated. I mean, again, it's so small, but we have a wing that's coming forward towards us, so I just want to emphasize that. And I'll do that by just adding some more blacks. Adding some French Ultramarine to my black to sort of intensify it a bit, and then just going over areas that have dried lighter than I wanted them to, because I want these to be pretty dark. Let's do the same for this back pelican. So since the rest is dried, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the tape. I always love this reveal at the end. Look at that clean borders. And there you have it. A little painting of pelicans flying over water. This is a simple exercise I want to re-emphasize, and I did it quickly, but you can see just with a couple of marks going dark to light, paying attention to the water ripple shapes, you can really do a lot and sort of simply convey a landscape like this.
I hope you enjoyed that exercise. Clearly, painting from a photograph is very different than painting in the field, especially for such a variable and interesting subject like water. So, I recommend you work up to and challenge yourself to paint live. Still, if this is your first time approaching water as a subject, I hope you found that this exercise gave you a preliminary understanding of the forms and colors of liquid water, enough that you can continue practicing on your own. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. You can access the other videos in the series on YouTube and also on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for joining me.